But I also know this. I know because there are hundreds and hundreds of people in this room that there are some of you right now. And if you were being honest, you're too shy to do it, you're not going to lift your hand, but if you were being honest, you would say, Jason, it doesn't feel like God is keeping his promises to me right now. There's some of you watching online right now saying you can't even come to church. Maybe you have a health issue right now and you're going, it doesn't feel like God is keeping his promises to me right now. There's, I don't know the things you're going through. There's some of you going through some financial issues. It doesn't feel like God's providing for me. Going through some health issues. Doesn't feel like God's protecting me. Going through some marriage issues. Doesn't feel like God is doing good to me. You're looking at your life right now and you're going, I don't feel the promises of God. I know what you're saying. I think I believe you, Jason, but I don't see the promises of God being fulfilled. And I want you to know this is a truth and a reality of this broken world we live in, that there are going to be moments when it doesn't feel like God is not fulfilling his promises. The book of Exodus, by the way, doesn't hide these moments. In fact, what you're about to see is that it opens it up very clearly and says, God, yes, is a promise keeper, but also hell itself fights against the promises of God. And there will be moments when it feels like hell is winning and God is not fulfilling his promises. If you don't know this, the storyline of the Bible, these big picture narratives of the Bible are important. One of the biggest one is that Satan wants to keep the people of God from receiving the promises of God because he knows we will bless God if we receive his promises. And Satan does not want us to praise God because he wants to praise for himself. So he has made it his ambition to stop the promises of God from coming to the people of God so that we will not praise God. And he works and fights tooth and nail to keep us from doing that. He's been doing that from the beginning, trying to stop us from receiving the promises of God. In fact, you can see it even in the terminology that is supposed to go back to Genesis chapter 1 and show you how Satan himself has been fighting against the promises of God. In fact, did you notice the terminology in verse 7? It says that they were fruitful and they multiplied greatly and they filled the land. Do you remember when that was first spoken? It's Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. God has created male and female, and he says to them, here's my command to you, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Those are very unique Hebrew words, fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And you go over to Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, and the very wording it uses is that they were fruitful, that they were exceedingly fruitful, and that they multiplied, and that they filled the land. The exact same three Hebrew words, showing that they were doing exactly how God intended to bless. This was God's blessing upon them. Here they are in a foreign land, and God is blessing them because they are obeying that command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But do you know what happened in Genesis chapter 1? After he creates Adam and Eve, before they even have a chance to begin to multiply, you move into chapter 2, you're introduced to their names, Adam and Eve, and then you move on to chapter 3, and before they can even begin to be fruitful and multiply in the beginning, there's another person who enters in. Actually, he slithers in. It's a little snake, and it's the devil, the ancient serpent, Satan himself. And his goal, like I said before, is to keep the people of God from receiving the promises of God so that we don't praise God. And sure enough, in the Garden of Eden, he comes up to Adam and Eve and says, no, God's against you. He's trying to hold you back. So you need this fruit so you can be like, he makes them lust after the forbidden fruit. They take the forbidden fruit so that they're kicked out of the garden, so they cannot receive the promises of fellowship with God. He's been trying to stop it because they were getting the be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. So he comes in to try to thwart it, and he does a really good job. And then you get over to Exodus chapter 1, verse 7. It says they're being fruitful, they're multiplying, they're filling the earth. And Satan sees the people receiving the blessing of God, and here he comes slithering in again. Except this time he doesn't come as a snake. This time he comes as Pharaoh. I want you to read what happens now that they're receiving the blessing of God. Listen to how the enemy fights against it. Going back to the book of Exodus, chapter 1, now we're moving on to verse 8. Here's what it says. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. And they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. Now stop there just for a moment. So here they're multiplying, they're receiving the blessing of God, and now you have this dude Pharaoh who steps in and says, I got to stop it. Now there's a few history details you need to know to really grasp what's taking place. First thing is that we don't know who this Pharaoh is. It says there arose a new king, and Pharaoh came against them. But it does not give us the name of this Pharaoh. And there are many people who actually struggle immensely with the fact that we don't have the name of the Pharaoh. We can't locate him in the the history books in ancient Egypt because they were very meticulous about keeping the names of the pharaohs in order. So we don't know exactly when it took place. And there are people, especially unbelievers, who will say, look, you can go back and read all of Egyptian history and you'll never read any story about any exodus taking place. You'll never read any story about these Hebrew slaves that rose up against the Pharaoh, about any kind of 10 plagues. You'll never read a story about these millions of Hebrew slaves being set free and then the water falling over the Egyptian army, and you won't read any of that. Therefore, it must never have actually taken place. This is just made up story to teach some kind of truth, but you can't trust it because it would have shown up, an event that big, in Egyptian chronicles somewhere. And so they discredit it. We don't know the name of the Pharaoh, and it doesn't show up anywhere, so it must not be true. But just in case, I don't think the majority of you believe that, but just in case that churns in your mind, I want to explain a couple things early on to increase your faith.